Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Janson X579, aka Shrimpy, wash processed Panama from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Manhattan, based out of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And if you thought for one second that I was going to miss out on reviewing one of their wash processed Panamanian Geishas, then you don't know me very well at this point, as we have reviewed every single one of the Janson coffees that Manhattan has released, beginning with their initial Janson release, followed up with the 547, and of course most recently their 600. And the theme I've noticed behind all of those is that I enjoy each one more than the one that came before it, with the 600 being my favorite to this point. So of course I was going to be reviewing this coffee as soon as we got the opportunity, and as long as Manhattan keeps releasing these Janson coffees, then I'm going to continue to review them. Looking forward to discussing yet another wash processed Panamanian Geisha from Manhattan. This right here is day 29 of this coffee. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 208 degrees Fahrenheit, and I like this one better through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Manhattan is a European light for the roast profile. And with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. So day 11, first impression, and can't help but notice the wonderful clarity that's coming from this cup of coffee. Not too surprising whatsoever. Pretty nostalgic Panamanian Geisha in the sense that it has a lot of white flowers and a citric aspect to this cup of coffee. In addition to that, there's a slightly herbal component, but for the most part, it was just kind of soft clarity on this first impression, which of course is going to give it a positive first impression. And it's typically from the first time I try it to the second time I try it that I notice the biggest change or shift in a cup of coffee. So that was just my first impression, and we're definitely going to see a little bit of a shift from what I'd experienced. Day 13, not quite as impressive through the Chemex, as it does provide an extra bit of clarity. So as you can imagine, this is already a super clean and clear cup of coffee, and it's already going to chart at that level 5. All the Chemex does is just kind of maybe heighten and focus that clarity in a sense and aspect that's not necessarily needed. And as a result, was experiencing a lot more of the heavy herbal tea components to this cup of coffee, and a fair bit of citrus as well. So not quite as enjoyable, but I said, hey, well, we're seeing some changes, so let's see what we continue to get from this coffee. Day 15, it has actually become a lot more herbal than expected. So it wasn't necessarily an attribute of the Chemex, it was just this kind of coffee in general, as it skews very heavy in that herbal sense. Tea aspect is the most dominant characteristic, and it has plenty of a lasting, slightly sweeter citric finish to the cup of coffee. Surprisingly longer lasting than I think I was expecting for this coffee. So it's been somewhat inconsistent to this point, but I will explain to you why that was on day 18, as I noticed that we had actually had issues with the water. So I think I mentioned that in a previous video, that there were some times we had some slight water issues as the water was off, and I feel like that kind of played a factor in how the coffee was coming out on those 2 days. But here we corrected the issue, and as a result, we have seen a lot of the strong citrus that I was experiencing kind of toned down, and we'll get into that in the tasting wheel as well. But the extras are gone, and it's much closer to the early days, with the exception of the fact that it's still super herbal, and that's not going to change for the rest of this review. Day 21, can tell the coffee has finally started to hit a sweet spot. So it was at this point where I felt that this was the ideal window for this cup of coffee, as it was getting a little bit more sweet, still quite even in terms of the sweetness and clarity. And the cup has the super herbal component that's, well, even more pronounced, and it is still the most dominant aspect to this cup of coffee, but it's been better. So we continue on to day 24. And tried it through the Chemex, said maybe it was just the time that needed to make the Chemex a little better for this coffee. And it was better based off of just giving a little bit more rest. But even then, as mentioned, that heightened kind of clarity and clearness to this cup of coffee wasn't necessarily needed, as it was already a pretty clear cup of coffee. The trade-off for maybe some more pronounced flavor and sweetness coming from the V60 wasn't worth it, wasn't needed. Still skewing pretty strong in that herbal tea direction, but improvement from this brew method as well. And then day 27, final notes we have, coffee has not lost any of its intensity. It has a little bit here on day 29, so I feel like our window was probably 21 through 28, where it was at its best. And it's still at its best when it cools down around room temperature, as there's a lot more of those floral aspects to it. In that sense, it's still a pretty herbal dominant coffee in general. A lot of that tea, it's just going to be there present from the very start to the very finish, right off brew, right to room temperature. Still pretty structured, heavy on those clean herbal earthy tea-like aspects, and there's a fair bit of bitterness that's kind of relative to both the herbality as well as the listed kind of citrus zest that they have on here. So that will be discussed a little more in the tasting wheel, and we'll go ahead and put up that tasting wheel right now so you can see what we're getting. All right, 3, level 5, so let's run through those real quick. The cleanliness. Yes, it is right there. These Janson X coffees are super clear. Like, they are some of the cleanest coffees I've ever had. That one's completely justified at that level 5. Again, if we're charting it with the Chemex, you could bump that up as part of a relative scale to something like a 6. Not necessary at all. I really like it there. That's one of the best parts of this coffee. The florals at a level 5, truth be told, it's on the slightly lower side of that level 5 because it is very much a secondary characteristic to the very strong herbality in the cup. And that right there is why the savoriness is at level 5. It's the first time I think I've ever put anything at a level 5 for a tasting wheel, and I think it doesn't take an expert to pick out just how strong and distinct this herbal component to this cup of coffee is. It is as pronounced as possible. Of course, it's going to come from the fact that this is a very clear coffee in general, so it's got a very clear base, and it paves the way for a very distinct and strong herbality to this cup of coffee. Some other things worth noting, the finish, level 4, I mentioned that it has a little bit of a more lasting finish than I think I was expecting, so that's kind of higher than I think I had expected going into this. And then the sweetness at a level 3, and that's obviously the biggest sticking point for me, as I usually like to have the sweetness chart minimum at a level 4. So it wasn't necessarily the sweetest cup of coffee I was experiencing, but I don't think it was necessarily meant to go in that direction. Citrus fruit level 3, they have a, I believe, orange zest flavor note listed on here. Yeah, it has a fair bit of that bitterness to it, and that's why the bitterness charts at a level 3. In addition to that, the herbality had a slight bit of bitterness to it too, so like this tea-like bitterness. And then the body level 2, that's probably the last thing really worth discussing because that's a little higher than expected. For the most part, every time I go into one of these wash-processed Panamanian Geishas, I fully expect them to be at a level 1. But yeah, this one was just a little higher than that, and I guess we'll touch on the acidity real quick. Definitely lower than I think I was expecting for this coffee. But I mean, it looks like a wash-processed Panamanian Geisha tasting wheel as it's skewed in specific directions and skewed very heavily in those specific directions. All right, my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. First things first, I feel like you can always tell that there's just a very distinct difference between just the overall quality of a cup of coffee from something like this as opposed to something that's a more standard offering. You can just tell with these Panamanian Geishas that they are just better quality coffees in general because they're so clear and they have such a clean base that you are able to just pick out these flavors without any sort of issue. Like, it doesn't take an expert to try this coffee and say, hey, this is just really strong on the herbals. As a result, I think that there's a pretty distinct pecking order in my favorite of these Janson coffees. I still like the 600 more, but that's clearly because it was my flavor profile coffee going into it. I knew when I purchased this one, it never sounded like my cup of coffee, and if these flavor notes were spot on, which to a credit to Manhattan, were 100% spot on, these were as distinct and as clear as possible, then it was going to have a very hard time being better and more enjoyable for me than the 600. With that being said, obviously it's a very exceptionally well done cup of coffee, and while it's not necessarily going to be my favorite, I do believe I liked it more than the 547, as this one just had a little bit more sweetness and it had a little bit more distinct of a profile, even if it's not necessarily my profile to begin with. Not the biggest fan of tea or herbality in coffee to begin with, so I think it's a credit to Manhattan as well that I enjoyed this coffee as much as I did, even if it's not going to be my favorite Panamanian Geisha, which is something I have probably too high of a standard for to begin with. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like this could actually be a really transcendent coffee for somebody that is very much into their herbality for coffee, especially for tea. This one is unique in its sense that it is just such a well done cup of coffee for that specific profile that anybody that really looks for those aspects to a coffee will enjoy this, probably to the point where it could be one of their favorite coffees of the entire year. So I think that's kind of the person I would suggest this to, kind of the way I'm leaning towards this coffee. But for the most part, I think I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this Janson, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Janson X 579 wash processed Panama from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.